one of the things that is baked into podcasting is there's both entry and exit friction. So it's really hard to get somebody to click play on an episode for the first time. But there's also this inertia, which is when they are a regular listener, they just build a habit around it and they keep doing it.
There are baked in advantages to podcasting that you don't get with other content. The initial threshold to overcome is greater, but once they commit, you've got something special there.
As a challenge to us as creators, we have to assume that people who aren't listening to us right now already have those top 3 shows in their feed. And so this is the challenge that we're up against. All right, so if you were to estimate, how many podcasts are you currently subscribed to in your app of choice? Pocket Casts, I believe?
Yeah, probably 100.
100, okay. And how many of that 100 have you listened to in the last week?
Maybe 7 or 8.
Interesting. So I actually did the math on mine. I looked through, and I actually keep my subscription list a little bit more cleaned than you do. I have 33 shows that I'm subscribed to right now. 22 I have ever listened to. So there's 11 shows I'm subscribed to. I've never even listened to a single episode, a single minute of any of those. There's kind of that, like, you buy the book because you're like, I want to learn what's in this book, but you can't bring yourself to read it, or it feels too daunting or whatever. So I've got 11 of those. Of the 22 that I've listened to, 19 I've listened to more than one episode, which is actually kind of interesting. So the shows that I do listen to one episode of, I tend to actually listen to more. So that's good. So we got 33 total, 22 I've listened to, 19 I've listened to more than one episode of. Of those 19, 16, I listened to at least 20 episodes or more. So a lot of, like, loyalty to that show. 5 shows I've listened to in the last month, and only 2 shows I've listened to in the last week of the 33 total shows that I've subscribed to.
Oh, interesting.
So, your listening habits are clearly a little bit different than mine, but I've been thinking a lot about this idea of how much bandwidth the typical person has to listen to podcasts compared to other media. And then I did the numbers here, and I was like, oh, I bet this is roughly true for most people. And your actual ratios here are probably quite similar to mine, where you've got 7 or 8 shows you listened to last week, 100 subscriptions. And so this has kind of just got me thinking more about, like, the dynamics of podcasting as a platform and some of the constraints that are unique to podcasting that don't exist for other platforms. Is this something you ever think about?
Yeah, this is so fascinating. And you bringing it up that way, I mean, I'm sure some people are feeling like that's a little disheartening to hear, like, how can my show get one of those slots? But I like this framing. Here's the reality. I walk to work every day and walk home. That's 25 to 30 minutes on my way down and 25 to 30 minutes on my way up. Maybe I'll listen again if I'm doing the dishes or chores at home. So if a show is 30 minutes, I can listen to 2 or 3 a day. If a show is an hour, I can listen to 1 to 1.5 a day. And I think, in the upper tier of consumption. I'm listening to a lot of shows.
And I think it's interesting to note, too, before we get into this, that I think people have very different consumption habits. So you mentioned that you listen to maybe 2 to 3 episodes a day. I actually do roughly similar. Now, parties, I didn't count client shows that I audit, because that's not really my personal listening time. But I am definitely a binger. And so I will find a show, I'll become obsessed with it, and I'll listen to 10 episodes a week, but it's only of one show, really. And then I'll get, tired with that, and then I'll move on to another one, and they'll kind of go in cycles. Whereas you, it sounds like, have your kind of stable of shows. So there are some different kind of listener behavior patterns here, but I think if we can kind of better understand the platform constraints, the things that are baked into the medium of podcasting, there's both some opportunities that I think come with podcasting that other platforms don't have, and also some severe limitations. But I think if we can understand what these are, we can actually design for them and hopefully get to that kind of top slot in our listeners' lives. So the thing, we're going to start off with the data like we always do. There's a couple of things here that I think are worth noting. For all the math nerds out there, we're going to get into your favorite part of the episode here. In the 2024 Podcast Marketing Trends Report, the typical episode from our respondents was 35 minutes. And so I, of course, then went to wonder, okay, so how many episodes make up a day? We've got the 24-hour schedule, but I think it's actually time to move to the podcast episode-driven schedule of the day. And so in a 24-hour day, that is 1,440 minutes, that equals 41 episodes a day. You could fit 41 of those 35-minute episodes if you listen back to back to back to back to back, 41 episodes a day in 16 hours, that's basically your waking time, you could fit in 27 episodes. And then we've got 4 hours. I thought, okay, that's a pretty aggressive podcast listener here. That's a lot of time spent listening to podcasts. That's 6 episodes. And
Yeah.
so 6 episodes, even for a heavy listener, I'm curious if you're thinking about your engagement on Twitter or TikTok or YouTube Shorts, like how many pieces of content do you think you engage with in a typical day in
Oh,
that time or less?
I mean, for all types of content, it's in the thousands. Probably in a day, I'll bet you I scroll through hundreds of posts on social media like LinkedIn, Blue Sky, Instagram. And then you think about Instagram Reels. And then if you get sucked into TikTok or any of those, you can be scrolling and flipping through content for hours. So there's some types of content people are consuming a lot of units. You have time in your day for 1 or 2 podcast episodes and maybe 1 or 2 TV shows if you're really dedicating a lot
Yeah.
of time to content.
It's interesting because, we're running some numbers here and saying like, okay, how many episodes could you fit into a day? Edison Research, they always put out the Infinite Dial report every year. And so they actually do ask podcast listeners, how many episodes do you listen to on average per week? And I looked up the past several years and it's generally around 8. The
Yeah.
typical podcast listener listens to 8 episodes a week. And so I think the thing that just jumps out to me here, that's basically like one show, and maybe that means one creator a
Mm,
day. And so you're thinking about you can consume hundreds or thousands of pieces of content from 1,000 different creators you could kind of engage with in some way on other platforms. But the typical consumer maybe only has room in their life for like 8 different podcast creators. And I think that's even a little bit maybe generous. I think most people are probably fewer. And so it just makes me wonder, like, what do we need to do as creators to earn a slot in that top 8 or top 5 or top 3?
mm,
So I guess I'm curious. You already mentioned that some creators who are listening to this might be like, "Oh, that's really demoralizing or
mhm.
intimidating." What's your any other kind of like initial impressions as you start to think about these kind of constraints of podcasting and the physical time limitations?
Yeah. On one hand, it is overwhelming because the bar is high. It's like, how could I, a lowly podcaster, get into that tier of being someone's, one creator that they choose for that day? On the flip side, I think people will see there's advantages to that. So once you earn that spot, there are baked in advantages to podcasting that you don't
Mm.
get with other forms of content. So I think people will see both advantages, but this is a nice framing because it shows people this is the game they're playing.
For me personally, I always want to know, like, if I want to see the mountain that I'm climbing and be like, okay, that's where I need to get to. And I
Mhm.
can decide whether I want to undertake that journey or not. But at least I have clarity on, like, I know what I'm doing. I know where I need to go. And I think that, with some of these kind of constraints of podcasting and the opportunities, the more that we can understand the dynamics here, the better we can actually make intentional decisions about how we structure our episodes, what our show concept or premise is, and like all of these different things that we can then be intentional about how we approach that and give ourselves the best chance at success.
Mhm.
And so we started off talking about time, which is a big part of this, and how much time people have for podcasts. This is kind of based on an assumption that podcasts tend to be longer form, which is not universally true. But there's also, it gets into this bigger conversation of kind of like platform dynamics or platform constraints.
Mm.
And so I'm curious, how would you kind of define that concept? There's constraints, there's platform dynamics, and there's also platform psychology or how people think about a certain platform. Like, how would you walk through this, whether it's like software or podcasting or YouTube or an app or something like that?
Yeah, there's the platform constraints are what's baked in to this thing you've chosen. So, as an example, TikTok, it's algorithmically driven. So, the
Hmm.
game you're playing there is how do I grab the attention of the algorithm? What gets me a spot in the algorithm that's being, tested on people all over the world? And then once you get that spot, the disadvantage is most people don't follow the creator. It's a moment and then it passes and then that's it. If we go the other way, like thinking about books, right? Like what are the constraints of writing and publishing a book? Well, people maybe will read 3 or 4 books a year if you're lucky.
Mhm.
And there's even something beyond that, which is interesting, which is like a lot of people buy books but don't read them. And is
Yeah.
that good or bad or whatever? And but what probably gets books sold is people actually recommending it. So it's everything that's in the medium of choice And based on how it's built, what are the advantages and disadvantages? What are the strengths and weaknesses? What are the opportunities and threats? It's all encompassed in that.
Yeah, and for each of those, it makes me even think there's further kind of platform constraints and dynamics here where with TikTok, there is a time limit. Like your video can't
Mm,
just be an infinite amount of time. Twitter was famous for the character limit. I mean, it still
mm,
has a character limit, but that's becoming a little bit more lax. But like that was one of the things that actually helped it stand out. But
yeah.
it creates a limitation where that's like created threads basically where people were trying to get around this platform constraint and developed a new way of communicating on the platform. And you
Mm,
look at something like books then, now we've got ebooks and everything like that. But historically, a platform constraint of books are the cost it takes to print the book. And so a longer book is going to cost more to get printed. I know a bunch of stuff. I don't know enough about the book world, but there is a certain size of book that is optimized for sales. A lot of publishers, they don't want to have a book that's too short. And so they will prompt authors to bloat it because it looks better on the bookstore shelves. It takes up more space and
yeah.
catches more eyes. And so there's all these kind of platform dynamics built in. Some of them help you and are beneficial and present opportunities, and other ones present challenges. But I think knowing kind of that system that you're operating within and how to navigate it, what the platform wants, and then there's this other side of like platform psychology, which is like the expectations and almost assumptions that people bring to a platform. And so
Hmm.
we can think people have a certain idea of what a podcast is. And this is a
Hmm.
big debate in podcasting right now, but they have a certain kind of set idea of what they go to a podcast in general to get, and what they go to an email newsletter to get, and what they're going to get from YouTube or a book or anything else. And so I think when we understand these, we can start to kind of play with those a little bit.
Yeah, in one sense, it's like characteristics of the platform. Like there's constraints, but there's also the things that the platform enables that other platforms might not. And yeah, I like the psychology part. Like when someone opens up their podcast player, what's their kind of thinking? What's their process of deciding?
Yeah.
And we could even go further back in that. Like before they open their podcast player, what are the other options that, they're like, do I feel like music today? It's like, no, no, no. I want something juicy for this commute to work. It's like, okay, so now you're looking for something juicy, whatever that means. And then
Yeah.
it's like, what do I choose based on what happens when I open up my podcast player? And I think most creators are not thinking on that level. They're just assuming, well, people are coming to my show. And so I've got to make, my intro really solid. But it's like, no, no, no. You got to start even 2 or 3 or 4 steps back, thinking both about the platform itself and the psychology the listener is bringing. And then think through, like, how are you going to be a part of that flow?
There's a really interesting example that came up in my Podcast Marketing Academy community last week where somebody was asking about email service provider platforms and was wondering about signing up on Substack and
Mm,
was asking like, what do you think of what Substack? Is my business a good fit for this? And it was interesting that another member basically wrote some comment along the lines of, when I think of Substack, I think of long form think pieces. Like
yeah,
that feels like a Substack newsletter, not so much email marketing. And
yeah,
it clicked for me. I was like, I couldn't quite articulate it, but I was like, yes, there is a brand of newsletter that belongs on Substack that is different from any other kind of newsletter. And that
yeah,
there is a platform psychology that people who read Substacks, I'm not even a regular Substack reader. I have that association with the platform and the people who are on it. And
yeah.
so you can get emails from everywhere, and I get Substack newsletters delivered in my email client, in Gmail or in Apple
Hmm.
Mail or whatever. I read them right there, but it still feels different because it's from Substack somehow. And so
Yeah.
there's this like halo of the platform or the medium that can extend and causes people to have certain assumptions that can be, in this case, potentially good. But if you're going to go against those assumptions, it might actually hurt you because people expect something from Substack or a newsletter on Substack. And if you're not delivering that, it might feel like you're breaking with the expectations in some way.
Yeah. Yeah. I just got an email from De La Soul, the old school hip hop group, and it was sent through Substack. And I was just like, this doesn't feel right. This isn't like the right spot for this. But if they'd sent me, an email through Patreon, I would have been like, oh, yeah, this feels fine.
I think the last thing I want to move on to some of the specific kind of platform limitations and dynamics and traits of podcasting. But
Mm,
the thing to emphasize here before we move on is that these kind of platform dynamics and platform psychology are not things we as creators can influence. they may over time change as either the platform changes as a whole or
Hmm.
that a large number of creators shift the meaning of what a podcast is. And so now as podcast is going to video and YouTube becoming more of a thing, there is a growing base of content consumers who has a different idea of what a podcast is than what it was 10 years ago. But no one creator can actually shift that. And so we exist within these dynamics. And I think that's an important thing to kind of keep in mind.
Yeah, I always say you can't change the market. Like you think you can influence. No, the market is in motion and you're just riding the wave. And I think podcasters need to recognize this is the kind of wave we're riding. These are the characteristics of it. We can't affect that. Like the weather affects that. It's our job to say, how can I best ride this particular wave?
So when you think about some of the kind of traits, characteristics that are baked into the medium of podcasting, what are some of the things that come to mind for you?
I was going to bring this up later, but I think I'll bring it up here because you had talked to me earlier about how it's a platform full of inertia. And I just
Mm-hmm.
think about like typically a podcast consumer is making a decision and then they're putting their phone away and then their
Yeah.
hands and eyes are busy typically.
Yeah.
So it's like I get in the car, I have a 30-minute commute. What am I going to listen to? I'm opening up my podcast player in that moment. I'm scrolling through what looks interesting. I'm choosing. I'm putting the phone down. I'm backing up. I'm driving. My eyes and my hands are busy. And it's not like other platforms where it's like, oh, here's one, here's one, here's one. Like you're just switching between videos. Podcasting is a very different medium in that sense. And I think inertia is a good way to describe it.
And I think like when I was thinking of words, I often think about friction, but then I realized like inertia is actually a better word for a couple reasons. Like I think friction is always a negative force. And so one of the things I really think about that is baked into podcasting is there's both entry and exit friction. So it's really hard to get somebody to click play on an episode for the first time because it is a big time commitment and because they might already have their 3 shows they love. And so they might, like me, subscribe to shows and never listen to them. It's like buying that book and
Yeah.
you don't actually listen. So there is friction getting somebody to get into it. There's the entry friction also exists in how do you promote it? And so if you're promoting through social media, people are in one kind of mindset that is not listen to a 45 or 60-minute long interview.
Yeah.
They might subscribe now. They might go click over to it, but they also might not. They might just scroll on to the next post. They might be aware of it. But so getting people in is really hard for podcasting, but also getting people out. And so a lot of times people are looking to use their shows to grow their businesses or their email list or something else, or even we all know getting people to rate and review and subscribe to the show.
Hmm.
Like getting people to do that is really hard, again, because their eyes and hands are busy.
Hmm.
And so those are kind of the negative aspects. That's where I was thinking about friction, where it's like if people are not already in motion with the show, they're not already regular listeners, it's hard to get them to do that. But there's also this other aspect of inertia, which is when they are a regular listener, they just build a habit around it and they keep doing it. And it often comes to own a certain spot in their day or a certain time period where you're in the car, you've made that one decision and now it's too hard for them to like go and find something else if they're not into it after the first 5 or 10 minutes.
Yeah.
And so it can be both positive and challenging. And I think there's ways to kind of play with that.
Yeah. And really, like most people opening up their podcast player in their queue, if they're following a bunch of shows, maybe there's 20 episodes there. And you might think, wow, like that sucks.
Yep.
Because I have to be one of 20. But on the other hand, it's like one of 20 is pretty good odds in a long form content universe. TikTok, it's like your thing has to stand out amongst 1,000 things. Like, and they're not going to be spending that much time with you. Whereas here, yes, the initial friction or that threshold to overcome is greater. But once they commit, now you've got their attention, you've got that listening time for a long time. And that is just such a great gift and opportunity. And it's really, I think, what makes podcasting so special is, man, it's hard to get a listener. But if you get the listener and if they're engaged, you've got something special there, which makes it more likely for them to build a habit and for you to become one of their, 8 creators, podcast creators that they listen to in a given week. That is just an incredible opportunity. And statistically, those odds are actually pretty good. There's maybe, I don't know, 150,000, 200,000 podcasts that are actively still releasing new episodes in the last 30 days or something. That's not that many. The competitive pool is actually pretty small compared to most media types, YouTube channels, books, TV shows. We're actually in a fairly small pond, and there's some advantages to that.
I'm talking about this idea of getting people's kind of this lock-in idea where it's like once you find a show that you like, you spend a lot of time with it. There's a decent amount of data on like the podcast advertising side of things, which is that podcast listeners are it's a highly valuable audience to reach. And this is also true if you own a business. I don't have nearly enough data and it's so hard to find because it's all anecdotal. But I've seen a lot of people share figures that are basically their podcast listeners convert to their products or services anywhere from 2 to 8 times the rate of their just social or email subscribers. And so I think like that's a really interesting thing too, where maybe you have a way smaller podcast audience, but the value is actually much more. And so I think that this is something that is baked into the dynamic of podcasting as well, is that it's actually quite a high trust medium. If we think about how much trust do you put in a TikTok content creator who you might have watched 100 or 500 or 1,000 TikToks of, I don't think there's that much trust in that person. But I think if you listen to 50 or 100 episodes of a podcast host, even like, let's say a 30 to 45 minute episode, not like super, super long, I think you trust that person way more than a creator on another platform.
Yeah, and you see this show up in the way that people recommend different formats. So I might repost an Instagram photo to my story because it's a cool photo. But I'm not saying, hey, you should go and follow this creator or this person. I'm just like, look at this little piece of content. What a cool piece of content. Whereas when people recommend podcasts, they're usually recommending the host or the creator. They're saying, hey, I really like respect this person. Like they just have a lot of insights and wisdom. So they're recommending the host or the creator more times than not. It's a very different modality there.
And I hope that this becomes more of a thing. One thing we've talked about in our podcast a lot is the idea of having a kind of compelling show concept. I think if you have a great concept, that becomes much more recommendable. Now you can recommend both the host and the concept and then any individual episode. But I think a lot of times like there is this like feeling like, oh, I know so-and-so needs to hear from this person, or like I want to recommend this person's perspective to a certain person.
As a case study, this show that I just started, there's some people that are going to come to the show because Brian, who's the co-host, and myself have built an audience, but we've married that with this concept, which is we're bringing 2 people on every episode that we purposefully are hoping disagree with our takes, that we're going to be teasing apart the nuance on any topic that we cover. And so that's kind of this idea of marrying, like, here's the host, here's the creator, and you might be coming for the creator, but then let's marry that with a concept that is compelling. Like it just creates this kind of momentum, this pull to the show.
Yeah. A couple other of the kind of baked in platform dynamics of podcasting. We would be kind of remiss not to mention RSS. We don't need to go into why that necessarily matters. There's lots of places to find that outside of this show, but that is a inherent kind of like technically baked in aspect of podcasting that is shifting as Spotify's trying to do things their way. YouTube's trying to kind of bring things in-house there, but this is still a core part of podcasting that has all kinds of interesting knock-on effects where you can transfer your show from one hosting platform to another and retain ownership of your episodes. You can kind of redirect that pretty easily. You cannot be shut down on any one platform, like if you're on YouTube or your Instagram account gets blocked, and then good luck finding your way through Facebook support. That's not a fun thing from what I've heard from anybody who's gone through that. And so RSS is certainly kind of one of the platform dynamics. And then actually going back to what we were talking about with the like show concept side of things, one of the things that I feel strongly about with podcasting as it currently stands is that there is this dynamic that the show actually has a lot of emphasis. And I don't think people think about that. I think historically people thought about podcasting as a convenient way to distribute content like a blog post kind of. And this is if we go back 10, 15 years. But I think as podcasting has evolved, people actually need to be thinking about what is the premise of the show, what is the concept at the show level, and
Hmm.
that is a huge part of what gets somebody to subscribe to a show and click play. And so
Hmm.
again, you can have like a host be part of the magnetism or the thing that attracts you to a show. You can certainly have episodes, but if you have those two things, plus you have a interesting show concept that people are like, whoa, that's an interesting way to explore this topic,
Hmm.
then you've got a lot of magnetism pulling people in. And so I think that's something that
Yeah.
not enough people are approaching their shows thinking about, like, what is the concept here? What is the premise beyond just a collection of episodes on a certain topic?
Yeah. And again, if you're thinking about this exchange, instead of spending money, a listener is really spending a lot of time. And so the bar has to be higher because they are going to push play and start driving for 30 minutes. This is a commitment. And if you let them down, if they're like halfway through that commute and they're like, like I wish I hadn't chosen this episode but I'm locked in, like I can't really fiddle with my phone and like figure out something else, then, you've lost their trust. So
Yeah.
the bar has to be higher for podcasts because of the way people are engaging with it.
And I think that actually maybe brings us to this next kind of point here. We talked about some of the baked in platform dynamics, but then there's also the kind of platform psychology. And what does in this case, listener expect of podcasting? And I'm curious, like, if you think about the medium as a whole, you've got all these content platforms that you engage with. Like, what do you go to podcasting for or expect when you hear that a creator that you already know and follow is launching a podcast? Like, how is that different from them launching a YouTube channel or, a TikTok or something like that?
Yeah. Oh, that's a great question. Really, it feels like to me, I'm about to consider entering into a more serious relationship with that person.
Mm.
So if I've been like casually seeing them post clips or, maybe I read their newsletter every once in a while, if they're asking me to follow their podcast feed, it's like, whoa, like this is getting serious. Like this could be a long-term relationship here.
Mm-hmm.
And the podcast creators that have been significant to me, those were long-term relationships, parasocial relationships that I've had for, in some cases, 10, 15 years.
Yeah, it's interesting. I don't know that I had considered this before until you said that, but there are many forms of content that I will watch a one-off video and that's
Hmm.
fine. I will read one blog post from somebody, and blog posts are very shareable. They get linked in newsletters, they get linked on social, whatever. It's easy to click in and click out. But I feel like if I'm approaching a podcast, I want to sign up for a journey. And I think
Mm,
I want it to be a companion long term. That's actually something I'm looking for.
yeah.
I'm not looking for a one off. And so there is something baked into the expectations of a podcast that you're kind of along for a bigger thing than just one episode here or there.
Yeah, I love the way you just put that. Like, I don't think that's the only job to be done or the only kind of mode, but it is a big one. I'm signing up for a journey, like to go on a journey with this person. There's a type of show that just fits perfectly. And again, the bar is higher for that.
Well, and the other thing that is different with podcasting from most other platforms is, again, it comes back to this book idea where you will buy a book, but not
Hmm.
read it immediately, but you will read it one day. And I think podcasting is like that too, where I have many shows where I feel like I am going to listen to this and I know I'm going to love it. It actually also makes me think of a long form, like television series where I watched season 1 of Breaking Bad back in the day, and I binged it all in like 3 days. And I was like, whoa, that was intense. I can't do this to myself again. I got to just like slow down a little bit, put the brakes on. I'll come back to this. And so I am bought in. I know how good the show is. And even better, that I know that it pays off in the end because of, you just live in
Hmm.
culture and you know that. And so for me, I'm like, I'm saving that for some time in the future. I get to look forward to that for a long time. I'm not ready to go on that journey yet, but I know it's there when I need it. And so I think podcasting is unique in that way too, where I can't think of a single newsletter that I've ever said, I'm going to bookmark this and I'm going to come back to that in the future. No,
Yeah.
if I want the information, I'll sign up now. Or YouTube videos. It's like I have a watch later queue, but it's not like whole channels that I'm just like, I'm just going to subscribe and tuck this away over here for when the time's right. It's
Yeah.
much more impulsive, I think. Whereas podcasting, I think as a whole is much more measured almost in the way people make decisions about shows.
Yeah, and you just mentioned whole channel. I think that's key too. It's like podcasting, you're really committing to getting this drip every time. It's like a new thing is coming into your queue every week. And if you're going to be a committed listener, you're signing up for the channel experience, like the whole
Mm-hmm.
thing. Whereas some of these other formats, like a YouTube channel, it's like I can just go in, see how to fix my engine, and then get out.
Yeah.
It's like I'm not going to sign up for that guy's engine repair channel. Some YouTube channels have this characteristic, but this is definitely a thing in podcasting. It's like you're signing up for the whole thing.
There's two things that are interesting about YouTube that you mentioned there. So one that I think of is Casey Neistat. His channel, so he's a different generation of YouTuber than what is more kind of prominent now.
Mhm.
His channel probably wouldn't like gain traction today,
Mhm.
but obviously he kind of like revolutionized the daily vlog. That is a channel where you would not, there's no point to watch one Casey Neistat video.
Mhm.
Like the content, I was listening to another podcast, I think it was on the Nathan Barry show, and they were talking about Casey Neistat and how great a filmmaker he is. And basically whoever the guest was saying like, the content of a Casey Neistat video is shockingly banal. Like
Yeah.
it's like him going to the airport and whatever, but he's such a good storyteller with the camera that
Mhm.
it pulls you in. But it's like you are going on a journey with that channel to get to know Casey in some sense and feel all along for the ride.
Yeah.
But with podcasting, I think that's almost more of the norm of you expect that a little bit. It's much more personal, I think. And I feel like there's almost this more immersive element too that
Mhm.
makes me think a little bit of books versus movies. Again, we keep coming back to books where you build that world in your head because there's not the visual and there's not the voices. Whereas with podcasting, I can't help but think that there's something going on in your brain as well, where you are actually being required to do a bit of work in that
Mhm.
you're hearing this conversation, but your brain is filling in some gaps and imagining some of the visuals or kind of wandering a little bit. And it's not just in autopilot mode. And I think
Yeah.
that that's something else that's really interesting with podcasting. And then the other thing that you mentioned with YouTube, you mentioned like how to fix my engine. I think I, as a consumer of podcasts, actually do not think of podcasting as a actionable medium. I
Mhm.
think of it as the place to go for more nuanced, in-depth kind of explorations of topics. And I think that this is something that's at odds with how a lot of people approach shows because we roast and I audit so many shows that in their description say like highly actionable strategies. And
Mhm.
I think some shows can pull that off, but I think that other platforms are always going to be way more actionable, way more shorter form than
Mhm.
podcasting is going to be. And so I don't always know that leaning to actionable is the best strategy in podcasting.
Yeah, this is making me think of other formats. So if we identified one, which is I'm signing up to go on a journey with this creator, there's the flip side of that too, which is I, the listener, am on a journey and I'm signing up for you to be my companion as I go through this journey. I think this applies to maybe
Hmm.
Jay Klaus and his Creator Science
Yeah.
show. So I am somebody who wants to be a full-time creator and I need a companion on this journey who will probably give me some actionable content, but it's at a different level. It's very much like Jay is the friend I go and meet at the coffee shop and we talk about business and we talk about my journey and he recommends a few things. That's the kind of relationship I see there. Jay could have another show and he does have this subcontext, which is some people might be signing up just to hear about his journey.
Hmm.
I'm just like interested in hearing how his story arc, goes. So I think that's
Yep.
there too. And then there's other formats as well, like Tyler Cowan,
Mm.
Conversations with Tyler. I'm subscribed to his feed. I'm not going to listen to every episode, but every once in a while something big happens or there's a person that I really want to hear him. I'm basically signing up to hear somebody confront people or ask really good questions around a topic that are,
Mhm.
incredibly like sharp. And I just like,
Mm.
I need to hear that sharp, more confrontational questioning, like no formalities, like let's just hear the deep stuff. So yeah, there's a few of these formats that are interesting in podcasting that are different, certainly than YouTube or TikTok.
So there's two more things that I think are really interesting that are worth pointing out in terms of the listener psychology with podcasting. The first is this idea of like podcasting as a platform that can help with your sales. A lot of people launch shows to support their businesses. I think a lot of people that we both talk to, certainly the majority of the people that I work with. And I think a lot of people struggle with this in that they're like, I get great feedback from listeners, like people love the show, but I can't get anybody to book a sales call or to sign up to my course or whatever it might be. And I think that this is a distinction in platform psychology between podcasting and email specifically, where I know I have signed up to probably dozens of mailing lists. I have like clothing companies and tech companies and online course creators and things like that, where I'm like, I have no intention of buying now. I don't actually want to read your regular email, but I do want to keep getting it so that I can remind myself that like when the time is right, I'm going to buy that thing. A sale comes around
Hmm.
or the timing is right in my life to sign up for that course or whatever it is. And I want to be reminded to get it. And so I've actually subscribed to be sold to, where I think all of us have those things in email where we actually choose to be marketed to actively. But with podcasting, I don't think anybody goes to a podcast expecting to buy something from it. And so I think that this is something, if you are a business owner, it's worth kind of keeping this in mind that like podcasting is great for some things. Again, there's that friction in getting people to take action. Part of that is the platform psychology. Part of that is just the platform constraints where hands are busy, eyes are busy. They can't just go click a sales page link. So that's the kind of one thing that I think is worth considering here as we're talking about this platform psychology. And then the last thing here when it comes to the listener psychology and platform psychology of podcasting is I think that there's an assumption on behalf of listeners, certainly on my part, that if I go looking for a podcast, I'm actually expecting to spend some time. And so you do see a lot of podcasts that are, 5 minutes, 10 minutes, 15 minutes. They're shorter form podcasts. And I think that it certainly makes it easier to overcome that friction and get in. But I think there's also on a lot of people's part, like they are coming to go deep on a topic. And so a lot of people are always asking, how long should my episodes be? And they're kind of worried about going too long. And yeah, I think the longer your show, the higher the bar it is to get somebody into the show in the first place. But I think depending on the rest of your concept and how you're framing the topic, there are people who are actually coming to the medium to get a deeper take on a topic than, they might get elsewhere. And so that's something that you can actually kind of align with if that feels, right for your content.
Yeah, I totally agree. So understanding all these kind of baked in dynamics, how do we create better shows that people want to follow? How do we get into that, being one of the 8 creators that they're following in a given week? What can we do about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think the first thing is just actually getting your mindset around that. And so, you mentioned the queue that you maybe have 20 episodes in. I just looked up mine. I've got 109 episodes in my to listen queue.
Hmm.
And I think the interesting thing here, both at the show level and the episode level, is I will never listen probably to most of those episodes. I will probably listen to maybe the top 5 in the queue. And it's always like something new is coming out that jumps to the top, bumps everything down.
Hmm.
And so I think that that's something that is worth thinking about is that if you're in that position at the top of the queue, or if you're in the top of somebody's feed, you have a built-in advantage that you're probably going to keep that. But it's also looking at like, as a challenge to us as creators, we have to assume that people who aren't listening to us right now already have those top 3, those top 8 shows in their feed. And so what are we going to do? It actually needs to be pretty sharp and specific, our pitch to people, like what they're going to get that is not already being delivered to them by other shows, either on our topic or on all the other topics that they listen to. And so I think the first thing is just like getting in our heads, this is the challenge that we're up against.
And to me, like, here's a good example practically for me. There's a few shows that they're mostly co-hosted shows. And
Mm-hmm.
if that episode pops into the top of my queue, I'm abandoning whatever else I'm listening to. I'm listening to that show. There's some topical episodes like Pod News Weekly is a show I subscribe to. I don't listen to every episode, but if the headline for the show, the title for the episode is something I'm like, oh, I got to listen to that right now, that will push everything else down. That goes to the top of the list. So there's different mindsets. And what you're just trying to do is, so for Pod News, for example, you're basically just trying to deliver the headlines and then understanding that some of those headlines are going to grab certain listeners more than others. And that's the job to be done. Deliver the headlines. And if it resonates, people will listen. Maybe a co-hosted show where a lot of it is about, your relationship with the host. And then just like, I got to spend time with these 2 people. That's a very different modality. And that can also work. You can construct your show along those lines. So show construction, and you talk about this a lot, the concept of the show, the hosts themselves, what is going to keep people coming back? And maybe they're not coming back for every episode. Prof G, Scott Galloway, he publishes 4 or 5 episodes a week. Most people aren't listening to every episode, right? But he wants the average episode to get X number of downloads. That's his target. And you can construct shows assuming that people won't listen every time.
The thing that comes to mind for me when designing for kind of the existing dynamics in podcasting on the platform is understanding like where the challenges are, what the hard things are about podcasting, and then really putting a lot of attention into those things. And so the reason that we have this other show, Roast My Podcast, is because so much of the decision to listen to a show is based on this very limited amount of data that somebody gets. It's the title of the show, it's the cover art. Those are really the first kind of filters. And then you get, okay, the description and the episode titles. Like almost none of the decision to listen has anything to do with any content, no recorded audio. It's all this visual stuff that people can scan and consume in a few seconds. And so I think understanding that this is the real challenge to getting people into the show, and that once we get them in, actually we have a good chance of keeping them if the content is good. Like I want to focus a ton of time and effort and energy and even money on getting a great piece of cover art, on really making sure my title is communicating the promise or the job to be done of the show, getting the description to be able to hook the people in, kind of communicate the relevance of the show to them, and then thinking about those episode titles. I'm the same way, where there's some shows I've got my queue, but if an episode title, I'm like, ooh, that is too specific, it's too relevant, it's timely, it's juicy, it's whatever it is, that one is now jumping to the top of my queue and bumping everything else down. And so I think that, you know, just because you have subscribers, we still have to win people over each and every week. And part of that's with the episode titles, which is of course based on our like topic selection and guest selection, things like that, how we're framing the episodes in the first place. But what are the baked in challenges with podcasting? And let me dedicate a lot of my focus towards overcoming those things. Another thing on the content side of the actual content within the episodes that comes to mind for me is thinking about the habitual nature of podcasts. I think that almost more than any other medium, podcasting is very habit driven, where you will have a show that you listen to every Tuesday as soon as it comes out. And you might actually, you know, plan your day around that to some extent. You know, on Tuesday morning in my walk into work, maybe I take the long way to work so that I can fit in this hour-long podcast versus the 30-minute direct walk there. But because it's Tuesday, I'm going to enjoy Money for Couples with Ramit Sethi has been one of mine, where I will build time into my day to extend my walk so that I can listen to that show because it has that place in my week. And I think the way to get there, to get to this habit building kind of experience with the show, is it actually has to be repetitive in some way. There has to be a consistent structure. The length has to be generally similar. And there also has to be a very consistent experience that a listener gets. And so they need to have basically 100% confidence every time they click play that they already know what they're going to get emotionally. They might not know what information they're going to get. They might not know what the story is going to be. They might not know what jokes are going to make them laugh, but they know that experience, that listening experience, and it's something that is really, really consistent. And I think that this is something where, again, it goes back to this idea where a lot of times podcasts feel like a repository of a bunch of different types of episodes that are just hard to associate in your mind. What do I go to this show to get? And so I think thinking about consistency, not only in release schedule, but also in listener experience is a huge kind of part of building that habit.
Yeah, and I want to zoom in. You just put it so perfectly. What am I going to get from this show emotionally? Like, so people have emotional associations with shows. Another thing I wanted my new show to feel like was that feeling when you're at a conference and you like go to a bar with a bunch of people and you're just shooting the shit. You're just like talking about the real life, trying to do this thing. And that's the feeling I wanted people to have when they listen, like having that, that emotional resonance. And I think understanding that a lot of shows do this job for people. Emotionally, they're getting something. You know, there's certain people that after a big political event or a big world event, I'm just like waiting for them to release their episode. And the emotional thing I'm looking for is just like, I need somebody to help me process this emotionally. So I'm just waiting for that voice that's going to calm me down, that's going to like walk through everything and really deconstruct it. And that's an emotional experience. They might think of it as like intellectual. No, I'm intellectually going through all this stuff. No, no, no. Your listener has an emotional experience to what you're doing. And understanding that is going to help you connect better with the listener. And hopefully, because the way you put it was like, they might not be able to articulate it, but they're feeling what that show represents for them. So when it pops up in their feed, they're like, oh yeah, it's time for that feeling.
Yeah. And I think, you know, on that front, like we were talking about before, where there's these multiple kind of sources of magnetism for a show, from the concept to the host to an episode. I think that that's similar with a show that is inherently intellectual. you can have a show that's purely intellectual, but if you also pair that with an emotional experience, that's
Mhm.
another deeper level of hook that keeps people coming back. And so they come, their rational brain is like, yeah, I come to the show to learn about this. But there's also this other pull that they probably aren't even aware of that pulls them into that show because the show makes them feel a certain way without them realizing it. And so I think,
Yeah.
you can have one or the other, but if you have both, that's something that's really
This would be a
powerful.
great thing to add to a listener survey that I've never actually seen anyone do, but have
Hmm.
a question around what emotions do you attach to our show and see how people feel about your show subconsciously.
I'm going to add that to my template. So, as we're kind of wrapping up this episode here, I'm curious if you have a show or several shows in mind that you think are just truly great podcasts, that these shows make
Mm.
great use of podcasting as a medium.
Yeah, I'll call out. I've mentioned the show before, but Notes on Work by Caleb Porzio
Mm,
is, I think, the best solo podcast I've ever listened to. He does it in
mhm,
one take, and it just feels magical to me that he has this
mhm,
gift of articulating himself in this way. I only listen to about half the episodes because he's a programmer and sometimes he'll talk about programming stuff that I'm actually not
mhm,
that interested in. I'm more interested in his thoughts on life and work and the brilliance of the show when he's experiencing something, and it would be something that he would normally maybe tweet or write a blog post on. Instead, he hits record and he just processes it out loud,
mhm.
10, 15, 30 minutes. And I just find it so refreshing. Emotionally, it does this job, which I go to podcasts a lot for this, which is articulate part of your human experience that is normally hidden, but
Mm.
that you are bringing out in a way that I can connect with, I can identify with. I can go, oh, here's another human on this journey with me, wrestling with this stuff the same way I am. And they even have some ideas on how they deal with it. I also have joked that it's like, I'm not religious anymore, but it's like going to church. It's like Sunday
Mm.
morning walk, listen to this. It's like, it feels like that to me. Like, I'm going to get
Yeah.
this kind of life human connection moment. And there's something very emotionally resonant about it for me.
I got a handful here that I listen to. These are many of the ones that are on my, certainly listening in the last month, if not the last week. I almost feel bad sharing because I talk about it so much. Is three books. I think this is just one of the most brilliant audio only or primarily audio shows that's out there. I think there's a great concept to it where it's an expert interview show and Neil, the host, kind of interviews the world's most interesting people. And so you can hear that. It sounds a lot like Tim Ferriss almost,
Hmm.
like the world's top performing people and dozens of other shows. But he has this unique device where he explores these guest stories and their experiences through their three most formative books. And
Mm.
so it's just such a unique frame to bring to a show, a different way of interviewing the same people who show up elsewhere. The other thing I like is he's got a whole manifesto on his site about their approach to books and to reading and to the audience. It is so clear that Neil has put so much thought into every touch point of the show and made such intentional creative decisions with how he structures the show and how he talks about the show and the brand that he's building. I think that that is just an exceptional use of the podcast medium and is one of my favorite shows as well.
Hmm. Just a sidebar. I think that framing of a show, you could, if you have an opinion. So my take on that would be instead of books, what three interactions or what three connections were most meaningful in your life? That's just a great framing for a show, but you can see it comes out of something I feel strongly about. And then you can
Yeah.
have this whole new take that no one else has had for, the boring interview format. So yeah, I love that.
A couple honorable mentions from me. I've got some shows on here. Ologies, one of the biggest shows in the world. Again, a wonderful concept behind that show. Good One, which is a podcast about joke writing and comedians. They come
Oh,
on, they play a
I
bit,
love
and
that
then they
show.
talk about,
I've been
yeah.
listening on your recommendation, and
Yeah.
it's so good.
And then Money for Couples, I've mentioned that one a lot too from Ramit Sethi and Jay Klaus's Creator Science and David Perel's How I Write. Those are some of the shows that I think are the best use of the podcast platform. And one interesting thing on those last three in particular, How I Write, Creator Science, Money for Couples, I actually think they were better podcasts when they were audio only. And I think
Mm.
they've all made a shift to embracing YouTube, which I think is good for the brands of all of them. And I think is actually a little bit hurt the podcast listener experience.
Mm.
Like 5 to 10%, not a huge amount, not enough for me to like really stop listening entirely, but I want to call out that dynamic because it does exist.
Mm-hmm.
What about you? Any honorable mentions?
I really like what Acquired is doing. I think that's super smart. I've been a long time listener of Making Sense by Sam Harris. Mostly Technical is that kind of buddy comedy show where there's two co-hosts and they just do a great job of having good takes on everything every week. So those are some of them for me. Like I said, I'm probably listening to at least 10, 12 different shows a week.
So if you're interested in checking out the full 2024 Podcast Marketing Trends report, you can find that at podcastmarketingtrends.com for the data, the kind of limited data we pulled from the report in this episode, and much, much more. And we'll see you next episode.